"You don't look like someone who flies first class." The words weren't loud, they weren't rude, but they cut with the precision of a scalpel, cold, clinical, and quietly devastating. The man who had just been turned away didn't stand out in any obvious way. A wrinkled button-up shirt, cheap reading glasses, and a weathered leather backpack slung over one shoulder. No tailored suit, no gleaming watch, no sense of urgency, just a middle-aged man, waiting silently. Moments later, a younger man in a charcoal blazer approached the lounge entrance. No ID check, no hesitation. "Welcome back, Mr. Cole." His usual scotch was already waiting. Polished smiles, effortless hospitality. The man who'd been turned away said nothing. He didn't argue. He didn't flinch. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook, worn at the edges, familiar in his grip. This wasn't the first time he'd witnessed this dynamic. It was the 23rd, but this time it happened to him. His name was Jackson Blake, 47 years old, founder and CEO of Skybridge Airlines, a company built with his own sweat, sacrifice, and stubborn hope. But today he wasn't the boss. Today he was Jim Harper, just another traveler on a 2-week undercover journey, determined to expose the quiet injustices embedded deep within the company he built. He had just been denied entry to the first-class lounge of the very airline he created because he didn't look expensive enough. How would that make you feel? You don't need to answer. Jackson already knew. It felt like your worth had been measured by the thread count of your shirt or the brand of your wristwatch. It was a humiliation that whispered rather than shouted, the kind that didn't bruise skin but eroded dignity. Not everyone could understand that kind of hurt, but for those who had felt it, it changed the way they looked at the world. Jackson sat quietly in the main terminal, just a few paces away from the frosted glass doors that marked the entrance to the first-class lounge. Beige leather chairs stretched along the wall, sterile and stiff. The fluorescent lights overhead were too bright. The boarding announcements too loud. But he didn't mind. This place had become his battlefield. He pulled out his black leather-bound notebook, the corners worn, the spine softened by use. Page after page filled with tiny handwriting, dates, flight numbers, gates, times. No emotion, just facts. He flipped to a new page and wrote, "Denied lounge access, no smile, no verification, no effort, judged by appearance, assumed economy." His jaw didn't clench, his shoulders didn't rise, but inside something shifted. This wasn't a one-off. This wasn't a bad day. This was culture, a toxic culture, quiet, invisible, and thriving in plain sight. He had seen it all over the last 10 days. A man in faded college gear, shorts and a hoodie, offering his platinum card at the counter, only to be asked for more ID. An elderly woman traveling alone, struggling to lift her bag into the overhead compartment, while a suited man 2 rows down was assisted, before he even stood up. A young couple in travel sweats told the upgrade list was closed just before a solo traveler with cufflinks and a Swiss carry-on was invited to first class without question. Jackson had documented it all, quietly. He hadn't intervened. He hadn't spoken. He was waiting. Until this morning, when it was his turn. It wasn't observational anymore. It had become personal. Still, Jackson didn't yell. He didn't slam his fist or demand to see a manager. Because he knew something most people don't. That outrage is easy to dismiss, but quiet rage, the kind that plans, the kind that waits, it changes everything. He had once believed that company culture could be steered from a boardroom on the 20th floor. Now he understood that the truth lived at check-in counters, in cabin aisles, and behind frosted glass doors where people were sorted instantly, silently, by how they looked. And this time, the boss wasn't walking away in silence. He didn't correct the lounge attendant when she said, "We just need to re-verify your status, sir. This area is reserved for premium guests." He didn't flinch when the man behind him, polished suit, gleaming watch, was greeted with open arms. "Welcome back, Mr. Cole. Your scotch is ready." Jackson nodded once, stepped aside, and sat in the public waiting area. Reflexively, he opened his notebook. The irony didn't sting, it sharpened. This was a company he had built from scratch, aircraft by aircraft, route by route, policy by policy. From a humble charter operation with a single leased jet to a trusted national brand with 28,000 employees and flights across every major U.S. city. And yet today, wearing clothes off a clearance rack and no visible badge of status, he didn't look like he belonged in the lounge. And that was the problem. He scanned the lounge once more. The name tag on the attendant's chest caught the light. Sarah Jennings, still smiling, now helping a customer with a leather briefcase and a designer laptop sleeve. It had always been there, Jackson realized. This subtle filtration of who looked important enough, who matched the aesthetic, who passed the invisible test, wasn't in any training manual. It wasn't in any algorithm. It lived in micro-glances, pauses, the narrowing of a smile. It was everywhere, and no one had noticed. Until now. Jackson leaned back, closed his notebook, and stared up at the ceiling. He had been on the road for 10 days. He was tired. But this story wasn't over. Tomorrow he'd fly again. 2 more routes, 3 more lounges, a few more patterns to confirm. And then he returned to headquarters. Not as Jim Harper, not as a man in jeans and a flannel jacket, but as Jackson Blake, CEO, founder, and living proof of the rot he was about to expose. Jackson Blake sat alone in his corner office on the 40th floor of Skybridge Airlines headquarters. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass wall behind him, thick, colorless clouds crawled across the Manhattan skyline like smoke over a battlefield. The glass pane shivered slightly in the wind, letting out a low, droning hum that echoed the heaviness tightening in his chest. It wasn't just a weather system rolling in. It was a metaphor in motion, gray, weighted, inevitable. Spread across his desk were customer feedback reports, fanned out like the remnants of a crime scene. Charts, numbers, red arrows plummeting downward. Satisfaction was down, loyalty indicators slipping. But what unnerved Jackson wasn't the math. It was the mood buried in the comments. Something off-key, something smoldering just beneath the surface. Something that data alone couldn't explain. The office door burst open without a knock. Only one person in the entire company had that kind of clearance. Elaine Barrett, Chief Operating Officer, 63 years old, silver hair pulled back, eyes sharp as glass, walked in with 2 coffees and a stride that had weathered boardrooms, blizzards, and budget wars. She had been beside Jackson since the company's humble beginnings. 3 leased planes, 1 chaotic operations center in Cincinnati, and a dream so fragile they didn't dare speak it too loud. "I'm guessing you've seen the numbers," she said flatly, setting 1 cup down in front of him without waiting for confirmation. At this point, Jackson muttered, rubbing his eyes, "I've memorized them." Elaine sat down across from him, dropping into the leather chair like it owed her rent. She didn't sugarcoat, never had. "It's not just the dip in numbers," she said, leaning forward. "It's the pattern, and it's repeating." Jackson slid a tablet toward her without looking. "I know, and I don't like what I'm seeing. It's not about lost luggage or flight delays anymore," he continued, tapping the desk softly with the end of his pen. "It's about treatment. It's about how people feel, or more accurately, how they don't." Elaine nodded, her expression tight. "The board's getting twitchy. Larson called me this morning." Jackson rolled his eyes. Laurason's been twitchy ever since we didn't install gold faucets in the first-class lavatories. Still, the anxiety in the room lingered, like humidity before a storm. He leaned back, eyes distant. Something's shifted out there, Elaine, and it's not something I can fix from behind this desk. Elaine tilted her head. That look. The one she always gave him right before he did something reckless and disruptive, and probably necessary. You're thinking of going undercover again, aren't you? Jackson didn't answer. He didn't have to. The idea had been taking shape in his mind for days now. Quietly, stubbornly, like a truth refusing to stay buried. Remember 2010? He said softly, when our East Coast regional numbers tanked and no one could figure out why. You spent 3 weeks posing as a gate agent in Charlotte, threw out your back, and uncovered the subcontractor scandal. The one skipping mandatory safety checks. Elaine winced. Don't remind me. I still can't lift a carry-on over my head. Jackson gave a faint smile. We learned more in those 3 weeks than we did from a year's worth of strategy meetings. But you're not exactly anonymous anymore, she cautioned. You've been on the cover of trade magazines, featured at that Forbes panel, and let's not forget the gala last fall. Jackson turned and glanced at the wall behind him. A neat row of framed magazine covers, leadership awards, glowing headlines, most of them collecting dust. His last major public photo was nearly a year old. To most of our frontline staff, he said, I'm just a name in an onboarding video. And that, he added, is what makes this possible. Elaine narrowed her eyes. You're serious? He nodded once, slow and deliberate. 2 weeks. Domestic routes only. No upgrades. No priority lanes. No corporate account. I'll book under my middle name. Pay with my personal card. If there's a crack in our culture, I want to feel it firsthand. And how exactly do you plan to explain the CEO vanishing for 2 weeks in the middle of a performance dip? Jackson pulled a folder from under a stack of travel expense reports. The Aspen Leadership Retreat, he said, smirking, the one you've been trying to force me into for the last 2 years. Elaine groaned. You hate that retreat. Still do, Jackson replied, but it makes a perfect cover. She took a long sip of coffee, watching him carefully. You understand what you're risking here, right? I do, he said quietly. But if we don't root out the problem now, there won't be a company left to fix. She stood, brushing invisible lint from her blazer. Daily check-ins, no exceptions, and if something feels unsafe, if anyone starts connecting dots, you pull the plug. Immediately. Understood. Elaine paused at the door, staring at him for a long moment. This is a terrible idea. It's the right one, Jackson replied, voice firm. There was a long silence between them, the kind that could only be built on years of loyalty and battles fought shoulder to shoulder. Elaine sighed. Fine. But if you end up scrubbing floors in Phoenix again like last time, don't come crying to me. Jackson chuckled under his breath, noted. As the door closed behind her, he turned back toward the window. The clouds had thickened. Raindrops tapped lightly against the glass, like fingers knocking gently, as if to say, it's time. But inside him it wasn't stormy. It was clear, unshakable. 2 weeks, 10 cities, 0 privileges, 1 mission. To find out what kind of service his airline actually delivered when no one knew the founder was sitting among them. What Jackson couldn't possibly know yet was that what he was about to uncover would not only challenge everything he believed about his company, it would shake the very foundation of who he thought he was. Jackson didn't return to the lounge after what happened the day before. Not after that. Instead, he sat quietly near gate C-14, close enough to watch the boarding flow but far enough to blend into the crowd, invisible by design. In his hand was a small black coffee. In his lap, the same leather-bound notebook, now nearly halfway filled. The spine had softened from use, the corners worn. This morning, though, the pages remained untouched. He wasn't writing, not yet. He was watching. And the pattern? It was holding. An elderly man approached the gate counter. Windbreaker. Orthopedic shoes. His Skybridge app clearly showed his diamond member status, but the young agent behind the counter, hair slicked with too much product, barely looked up. "You're a little early, sir. We'll call boarding by group," he said, already turning back to his screen. 10 minutes later, a woman in tailored business wear with a designer tote strolled up. The same agent smiled, immediately tapped the upgrade system, and checked her status, even though she hadn't asked. Jackson didn't frown. He didn't sigh. He just flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "Two passengers, same status, wildly different energy." That's when he heard the voice beside him. "They did the same thing to me last month." Jackson looked up. A man late 50s had taken the seat next to him. He set a worn canvas duffel down by his feet. Travel pants, collared shirt, windbreaker that had seen hundreds of terminals. There was a friendliness in his voice, but beneath it, fatigue. The kind that comes not from travel, but from quietly enduring indignities long enough to stop expecting better. "Lounge staff?" Jackson asked. "Yup," the man nodded, jerking his chin toward the glass doors. "Sarah's been doing that move for months. Delays the ones she thinks don't belong, fast tracks the ones with the right look." "You fly often?" Jackson said, already guessing the answer. "David Mitchell, Diamond since 2007, the man offered, extending a hand. "Used to be proud of that. Now it just feels like a badge that only works when I wear a suit." Jackson shook his hand. "Jim Harper, Platinum." "You new to this route?" "Not exactly," Jackson said carefully. "I'm observing." David raised an eyebrow but didn't push. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, gaze sweeping across the terminal like a man who'd done it hundreds of times. "You start to notice it when you stop traveling for meetings," he said. "I used to be VP of sales, now I consult, so I dress how I want. That's when things changed." Jackson listened quietly, leaning in without leaning forward. "Used to be pre-boarding, upgrades, gate agents knew my name. Now, secondary ID checks, random re-verifications, missed upgrades, even when I'm top of the list. Thought I was imagining it until I started keeping track." Jackson's pulse jumped. "You keep notes?" "No." David reached into his duffel and pulled out a neatly folded sheet of paper. Printed dates, handwritten notes in the margins, flight numbers logged like case files. "Don't have time to write a novel," David said, half laughing. "But I track the patterns. I'm a numbers guy. Numbers don't lie." Jackson held the paper a moment longer than he needed to, studying it, memorizing it. "Have you ever filed a complaint?" David gave a short, bitter chuckle. 3 times, got the usual script. "We value your feedback. We're sorry for your experience. We'll forward this to the appropriate department." He turned slightly, eyes flicking toward the lounge entrance. "I don't want perks. I just want to feel like my loyalty still means something, even if I'm not dressed for a damn board meeting." Jackson nodded slowly. "I know what that feels like." David studied him. "Do you?" Jackson gave a faint smile. "Let's just say I've had some recent clarity." The boarding announcement crackled overhead. "See you on the plane, Jim," David said as he stood, stretching. "We're both in 3C and 3D. Hope you like aisle seats." David walked off. Jackson remained seated, the printed sheet still in his hand. He stared at it a moment longer, then folded it with care and slid it into his notebook. The cracks were no longer hypothetical. They had names, faces, flight histories. And if David Mitchell was right, if others had noticed this too, then Jackson wasn't just confronting a customer service issue. He was staring down a culture that had forgotten who it was built to serve. He stood slowly. His coffee had gone cold. It was time to board. But this time, he wasn't just watching. He was listening. And the story? Far from over. Jackson opened his notebook, jotted 2 more quick notes about gate staff behavior, then he closed it. He was about to settle in for the short flight when someone slid into the aisle seat beside him. He glanced up instinctively, then paused. Ian Walker, the flight attendant from Denver. Off duty now, dressed in jeans and a Skybridge hoodie, already thumbing through her phone at lightning speed. She didn't recognize him. Jackson hadn't expected her to. Flight attendants saw hundreds of faces each week, and Jackson, in this version of himself, had been meticulously engineered to be forgettable. Still, his stomach tightened. He turned toward the window, but kept part of his peripheral vision on her screen. Not intentionally at first, just habit. But then, a name flashed. Thomas Reed. Jackson blinked. Thomas Reed, head of regional operations, Skybridge Airlines. The man who oversaw several hubs, including Atlanta. He watched as Diane typed. Some guy made a scene at a TL lounge, looked like a confused professor or something. Kept claiming he was Diamond. Sarah made him wait outside. We flagged it. Jackson went perfectly still. No raised eyebrows, no clenched fists, just silence, absorbing every word as if they were typed directly into his brain. The reply came fast. Thanks. Watch for similar behavior at LAX. Same protocol. Diane responded without missing a beat. Already handled. Flagged him in the system. Re-verify ID at check-in. Random security check if necessary. Another message followed. You know the drill. She sent back a thumbs-up emoji and tucked her phone into her hoodie. Jackson exhaled slowly. This wasn't about hunches anymore. This wasn't about unconscious bias. This was a system. A coordinated protocol. Not listed in training manuals. Not documented in customer experience slideshows. Not broadcast at leadership retreats. Owned but real. Alive. And operational. Executed through messages like these. Quiet, casual, off the record, and carried out by people who thought no one was watching. People who had, either by assumption or instruction, decided that certain passengers didn't deserve the benefit of the doubt. That trust could be earned or denied based on appearance, speech, or wardrobe. Jackson's face remained still, expression neutral. Diane pulled out a travel pillow and leaned back. She still didn't know who she was sitting next to, but Jackson knew now. He knew exactly who she was and who she was working with. This wasn't bad manners. It wasn't incompetence. It was intentional, in structure, authorized by someone with power. And for the first time since this journey began, Jackson wasn't just disturbed. He was furious. Not the explosive kind of anger, not the kind that shouted and stormed, and cold kind, the kind that simmered, that calculated, that planned. He didn't sleep that night, not for a second. Instead, he sat at the small desk in his Los Angeles hotel room, half the curtain drawn open to let the city's light bleed in. Before him was a battlefield of notes, flight logs, internal policy printouts quietly funneled by a lane from HQ. Jackson had spent 10 days observing people. Now it was time to uncover the system that trained them. Under the unrelenting glow of a desk lamp, Jackson sat motionless in his hotel room. The pages of his notebook fanned out like battle plans. For days he had documented behavior, human, subjective, personal. He had filled pages with tiny handwriting, recording glances, body language, decisions made in seconds. But after what he'd just witnessed on the plane, the quiet message exchange between Diane and Thomas Reed, he knew instinct wasn't enough anymore. It wasn't just about a few bad actors. This wasn't negligence. This was architecture. He wasn't chasing smoke. He'd found the fire. The phrases in Deanne's messages were not throwaway slang, flagged, same protocol, re-verify. They weren't improvised. Someone had written them into a structure, into muscle memory, into systems that were now operating independently of conscience. And that someone had access, authority, a view from above. Jackson started digging. He pulled up Thomas Reed's name in the internal directories and filtered through 14 months of internal memos and initiative briefs. Reed's signature was everywhere: regional optimization, onboarding streamlining, customer optics, standardization, sterile phrases designed to sound strategic, harmless. But when Jackson cross-referenced those dates with customer feedback patterns, the results were as sharp as they were damning. The timeline aligned perfectly. It all traced back to one moment: the acquisition of a smaller struggling carrier, Everspan Air. Reed had come over with it, bringing a small cadre of middle-tier managers, now scattered across Skybridge's hubs like sleeper cells. And from the Atlanta office, Reed had quietly introduced a tiered service prioritization model. On paper, it was meant to minimize friction for high-value passengers. But nowhere in the implementation notes did it define what that meant. Only broad language like frequent flyers, premium tier, and, most tellingly, brand-aligned presentation. That last phrase, it made Jackson's stomach clench. He pushed deeper. Elaine, always surgical, had discreetly pulled back-end system logs from gate terminals and lounge check-ins, the override commands, the re-verification prompts, the loyalty flagging. None of them were triggered automatically. They were manual. All of it. Judgment calls at scale, executed by frontline staff under the illusion of empowerment. What began as a system meant to enhance efficiency had metastasized into a tool for class-based exclusion, a filter, quietly sorting people not by loyalty or merit, but by whether they looked like they belonged. And often, they didn't. At least not by someone else's standards. The numbers weren't just confirming a trend anymore, they were exposing intent. He traced override actions back to individuals: Sarah Jennings in the Atlanta lounge, Kevin Rowe, gate agent in LAX, Diane Walker, now branded in his memory not by her flight service, but by her typed words. He wrote them down: names, dates, actions. One more name went at the top of the page: Thomas Reed, the architect. The one who had given life to this doctrine in a side meeting, or a hallway nod, or perhaps a memo couched in ambition. He didn't need to say the words make him feel lesser. He'd built a machine that did it for him. As dawn spilled across the skyline outside his penthouse windows, Jackson's This wasn't a training issue, this wasn't a legacy protocol problem, this was a leadership failure. Someone, likely several people, had decided that dignity was not a right but a privilege, and then they handed the power to judge who deserved it to people with no business making that call. He didn't need more evidence, he needed accountability. When he returned to his apartment overlooking the East River, the transformation began. The glasses came off. The salt and pepper beard, cultivated as camouflage, was shaved clean. The worn flannel shirt, the scuffed walking shoes, they were folded away, replaced by a tailored navy suit and polished Oxfords. He adjusted the knot of his blue silk tie, not to admire, but to align, to reset. He didn't look different. He looked like Jackson Blake again. But no mirror could show what he carried inside now. The following morning, Skybridge HQ stirred with its usual cadence: cheerful greetings, espresso shots lined up at the cafe bar, the shuffle of polished shoes on marble floors. But when Jackson stepped through the glass doors, something shifted. The greetings slowed. Heads turned, not because they recognized a CEO returning from a leadership retreat in Aspen, but because of his eyes. Clear, focused, quietly volatile. Elaine was waiting on the 40th floor, seated in his office like she had been expecting a storm. "The meeting's at 11, she said. "Legal is briefed. HR's in standby. No one outside this room knows the full picture." Jackson nodded and peeled off his coat. "Push back?" he asked. Larson complained. "Said he has a charity auction in the Hamptons." Jackson smirked. "He can explain that to the shareholders." He sat down and opened the personnel files. Sarah, Diane, Kevin, no longer just names from a spreadsheet, but people he'd watched abuse discretion in real time. At the top was Reed, fast-tracked after the acquisition, glowing performance reviews, but only for operational efficiency. Never once did customer experience get a mention. Elaine noticed his jaw tighten as he read. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. By 11 a.m., the boardroom was full. 12 members, investors, legal advisors, former airline executives, and one quiet founder emeritus who almost never spoke. The room fell silent as Jackson entered. No smiles, no chit-chat. Just a gravity that settled in the air. "Thank you for making time," he began, voice even, deliberate. "What I'm about to present is not a report. It is not conjecture. It is evidence. And it demands immediate response." Over the next 50 minutes, Jackson walked them through everything, not like a CEO making a pitch, but as a witness giving sworn testimony. He played security footage, read from anonymous complaint logs, pulled up internal messages and flagged account histories. Then came the final blow. He told them what no one expected, that he had gone undercover, flown coach for 2 weeks, lived inside the very systems they had trusted to serve their passengers. "What I experienced," he said, pausing to let it land, "was not a customer service issue. It was systemic bias, based on perceived status and visual judgment. Our people are making decisions about who matters based on clothing brands, grooming habits, and arbitrary assumptions. And it's happening under policies this board approved." A board member tried to object. "This still feels anecdotal. One person's experience isn't necessarily..." Jackson cut in. Calm, precise. "Then explain to me why I, your CEO, was flagged for secondary ID verification 3 times in 4 cities while wearing a $39 jacket." Silence. Then came the list of actions. Immediate suspension and full review of personnel involved. Revocation of all discretionary override authority. Mandatory retraining for all frontline staff. And the creation of a passenger advocacy council, independent, empowered, reporting directly to the office of the CEO. "This will be expensive," the CFO said. "Not as expensive as a class action lawsuit," Jackson replied. "Or the cost of betraying the trust of the people we exist to serve." The board voted. 10 in favor, 2 abstentions. It was done. Jackson stood before the first congratulatory nod could form. "This is just the beginning," he said. His voice was steady, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not here to save face. I'm here to change the face of this company." And by nightfall, 17 employees had been suspended or terminated. 5 of them were senior enough that Jackson delivered the news himself, including Thomas Reed. The CFO leaned forward, voice measured but tinged with unease. "This is going to be costly." Jackson didn't flinch. "Not as costly as a class action lawsuit," he replied calmly, "or the price of betraying the trust of the very people we claim to serve." The vote was swift, 10 in favor, 2 abstained. It was done. Before anyone could offer congratulations, Jackson stood. "This isn't the finish line," he said, scanning the boardroom with eyes that no longer asked permission. "This is the starting gate. I'm not here to save face. I'm here to change the face of this company." By nightfall, 17 employees were either suspended or dismissed. 5 of them held roles high enough that Jackson made the calls himself, including Thomas Reed. The confrontation was brief. Reed had been summoned under a vague pretense, a policy discussion. He walked into the executive briefing room with a mix of curiosity and quiet arrogance. But the moment he saw Jackson alone at the table, a thick folder in front of him, his expression sharpened. "Mr. Reed," Jackson said without rising, "have a seat." Reed settled in. "Is this about the upcoming policy rollout?" Jackson slid the folder across the table. "This is about your interpretation of brand-appropriate passengers, your abuse of manual override systems, and the discriminatory flagging model you initiated across multiple hubs." Reed tried to recover. He leaned forward, invoking metrics, performance gains, pushing back with corporate jargon. At one point, he even issued a veiled threat, something about shareholder value and retaliation. Jackson didn't blink. When he spoke again, his voice was flat steel. "You were arrogant enough to believe no one was watching. You were wrong. No yelling, no raised voice, just truth, undeniable, inescapable." When security entered, Reed didn't fight. He turned once at the door, perhaps looking for a crack in the verdict, a flicker of mercy. But Jackson was already flipping open the next file. That night, Jackson stood alone in his office, one hand in his pocket, the other cradling a cup of coffee long gone cold. The city sprawled beneath him, runway lights blinking in the distance like drifting stars. Elaine entered quietly, the air behind her calm but charged. "It's done," she said. "The system is locked down, access revoked, legals confirmed compliance. Tomorrow, we start again." Jackson didn't turn. He just nodded, his eyes on the lights below. "Schedule a full company broadcast. First thing tomorrow. Every terminal, every lounge, every back room. I want them to hear it directly from me. No leaks, no rumors." Elaine paused. "Already scheduled." She hesitated, then added softly, "You did the right thing, Jackson." He exhaled. "I just hope it's not too late to make it right." At 9:00 IEM Eastern, Jackson Blake stood alone in the Skybridge broadcast studio. No script, no teleprompter, just him. A dark suit, sleeves rolled, the red light blinked on. And across the country, on loading docks, in cockpits, in lounges and maintenance bays, over 24,000 employees stopped what they were doing and watched. He began. "Many of you know me as the founder of this company," he said, steady and low. "But most of you probably don't know that Skybridge started with nothing but a folding table, 2 routes, and a prayer we could last 6 months. I swept the hangars myself, hauled bags in the rain, served water during delays. I've apologized face to face for every single thing we didn't get right. I didn't build this company just to move people. I built it to serve them, fairly, with dignity." He paused. The stillness on the line was deeper than silence. It was reverence. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that. 2 weeks ago, I walked out of this office. I became a passenger again. Not a CEO, not a name on the side of a plane, just a man in seat 22B. What I saw changed everything. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. It wasn't about how I was treated. It was what I witnessed. People like David Mitchell, a Diamond member for 15 years, being pushed aside because he no longer looked like a first-class flyer. An elderly woman lifting her own suitcase, while a man 2 rows up was helped before he even stood up. Passengers paying the same, flying the same, receiving less, simply because of how they looked. Each word struck like a hammer. We didn't just fail them. We failed them quietly, systematically, behind polished counters and rehearsed smiles. He took a breath. The answer today. Yesterday, 17 employees were held accountable for violating our core values. We've suspended every discretionary override system. We've launched a passenger advisory council comprised of real customers with the authority to provide direct feedback on how we serve, from ticketing to touchdown. We're also launching the Frontline Leadership Program. Every vice president, every director, myself included, 2 days a year on the ground, not as figureheads, as crew. Because if you want to lead, you need to feel what's happening. He paused, his voice dropped a note. You might be wondering why I'm saying this out loud. The reason is simple. Silence is complicity, and Skybridge will no longer be silent. He leaned forward, eyes locked on the camera. Intimate now. When I was 19, I spent the night stranded in an airport. Flight canceled, no money, no hotel voucher, just me and a vending machine that stole my last $3. I asked for help. The agent looked at me, ragged backpack, torn jeans, exhausted face, and said, "Figure it out." That night, I slept between 2 rows of chairs while other families were quietly rebooked. I made myself a promise. If I ever built something, no one in my system would be treated like that. His voice was raw now. I forgot that promise. A long pause. But now I remember. The camera light dimmed, the stream ended. Across every Skybridge terminal, a hush spread. Some employees bowed their heads. Others lifted their gaze, a flicker of something returning to their eyes. Purpose. No one walked away. That afternoon, Jackson returned to the airport. No cameras, no press release. He stood at the same gate where David Mitchell had once been ignored. This time, when an elderly couple approached the counter, the gate agent smiled first, confirmed their seats, and stepped out from behind the desk to walk them to the gate. No designer luggage, no glinting status card. Just 2 people, seen. It was a beginning. That weekend, Jackson invited David Mitchell to his office. No photographers, no speeches, just 2 men, watching planes climb into the sky. You didn't have to speak up that day, Jackson said. But you did, and it made a difference. David smiled gently. I just wanted to feel like I still mattered. To the company I believed in. You always mattered, Jackson replied. We just forgot to show it. He handed David 2 first-class tickets anywhere Skybridge flew, a gesture, not a reward. More importantly, he asked David to join the new Passenger Advisory Council. David nodded, then held up a single finger. On one condition, he said. Don't forget this happened, and don't ever let it happen again. Jackson held his gaze. I won't. That night, in his office, Jackson opened the weathered notebook one final time. He wrote the last entry, then gently closed the cover. Respect isn't an upgrade. It's the flight itself. The next morning, every Skybridge employee received a message, a new training module, revised service standards, and one line, bolded at the top of every onboarding document from that day forward. From now on, every passenger, every time,